He signed the divorce papers while she was still unconscious on the operating table. 3 premature babies fighting for their lives in plastic boxes, and he never once asked if they were breathing. He walked away in his expensive shoes, past photos of happy families, and canceled her health insurance before she even opened her eyes. He thought he had erased her. He thought she was finished. But the woman he threw away like a line item on a balance sheet? She was sitting on an empire he never knew existed, and the very children he abandoned, the ones he called a professional risk, were the key that unlocked it all. This is the story of Marilyn Lynn Parker, a mother who woke up alone after emergency surgery with no husband, no insurance, no home, and $47 in her bank account. A woman who rode the subway every morning on an empty stomach just to stand behind a glass wall and watch her babies fight to survive. And while the man who destroyed her was drinking champagne at charity galas, she was building something in the silence, something he would never see coming until it was far too late. This story will show you a powerful truth. The people who try to erase you often hand you the very weapon that will rewrite your entire future. Your silence is not weakness. It is your most dangerous power. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have loved you, stay until the very end. And if this story hits close to home, drop a comment below. You'd be surprised how many people in this community share your story. Now, let's go back to where it all began.
His mistake was signing his name in a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and blood. While Lynn lay unconscious after an emergency C-section, Grant finalized their divorce without a second thought. He never asked if their 3 newborns were breathing on their own. He only asked his lawyer how fast it could be done. A doctor had pleaded with him, explaining that his wife was in critical condition. "I am no longer her husband," he'd replied, his voice flat with indifference. He then walked away, his expensive shoes echoing past photos of happy families, leaving his wife uninsured and his children fighting for their lives in plastic boxes. But what drove him to such cruelty? It wasn't hatred, it was strategy. His company was just 6 weeks from a major funding round, and investors, he reasoned, value strength, not sentiment. In his mind, a wife in recovery and 3 fragile babies were not a family. They were a professional risk, and Grant Holloway was a man who always eliminated risk. The second the pregnancy became complicated, Lynn and their children became a liability on his balance sheet. He wasn't ending a marriage, he was cutting a variable from an equation to protect his bottom line. And with that, the whole picture comes into focus. The signature wasn't the beginning of her story's end, it was simply his calculated opening move. So that's how it all started. The sterile quiet of the NICU felt different now. It was a sound of healing, not desperation. Lynn stood watching her 3 children, no longer behind glass, but in open cribs, breathing on their own. The wing, now named the Parker Hale Center for Neonatal Care, was a testament to how quickly a world could be remade. Justice hadn't been a loud, dramatic verdict. It was this quiet, steady rhythm of tiny heartbeats. She often wondered if Grant ever knew that his attempt to sever her lifeline had accidentally reconnected her to an empire. This peaceful moment, however, was born from a night of absolute terror. A night that began with a soft, unexpected knock on her hospital room door. A man who introduced himself as a lawyer, here to discuss not her precarious present, but her forgotten past. "My name is Ethan Cole," he'd said, his voice calm in the sterile room. "Dr. Naomi Reed sent me." Lynn's first thought had been of her babies, a fresh spike of fear. But he quickly assured her they were stable. "This isn't about their health," he explained. "It's about your name." She could only manage a bitter laugh. It means I trusted the wrong man. Ethan's expression remained serious. No, he corrected gently. It means Parker. And with that single word, the ground began to shift. He explained that her grandmother, Eleanor Parker Hale, had established a massive, private investment trust. A trust that had been tangled in legal battles for years, completely frozen. Why now? Lynn had whispered, her voice cracking. Because of a clause, Ethan had revealed, pulling a thick, aged envelope from his briefcase. It activates only upon the birth of legitimate, multiple heirs. Her breath hitched. Her children. They hadn't just been a liability Grant wanted to shed. They were the key. The trust, however, required a 90-day review period, leaving the assets locked. So it doesn't help me now, she'd said, hope turning to ash. But Ethan leaned in, his voice firm. It helps you more than you know. From the moment they were born, you became legally protected. But he wouldn't have been in that room at all if not for a doctor who refused to let cruelty masquerade as hospital policy. Dr. Naomi Reed had been a neonatologist for over 2 decades. She recognized the pattern immediately. 3 premature infants, all requiring advanced care, suddenly flagged for financial review after a messy divorce. When a junior nurse confirmed that administration wanted a plan to downgrade intervention if insurance lapsed, Naomi's decision was instant. Absolutely not, she'd declared, her voice echoing with authority. She marched to the NICU, her focus entirely on the fragile but stable lives depending on her machines. She reviewed Marilyn Parker's file. Emergency C-section, divorced hours after surgery, no next of kin listed. It was a picture of engineered isolation. That was when she unlocked a secure file she hadn't opened in years, filled with legal guidance from a similar case that had nearly destroyed a young mother. She made a call to a number she knew by heart. Ethan Cole, it's Naomi Reed. After she explained the situation, the sudden divorce, the insurance termination, the pressure to make medical choices based on cost, there was a long pause. Do you know who Marilyn Parker is? Ethan had finally asked. When she said no, he told her, do not let them move those babies. Document everything. He knew the name, and he understood what it meant. Empowered, Naomi returned to her team. No changes to any treatment plan without my direct approval, she commanded. That evening, she visited Lynn herself, finding a woman hollowed out by fear. I'm Dr. Reed, she said gently. Your babies are alive, and they will stay that way. When Lynn tearfully confessed they were trying to take them from her, Naomi took her hand and promised, not without a fight. As she left, she sent a confidential email detailing every irregularity. She had just laid the first paving stone on the path to justice. This was the silent countermove to an act of breathtaking cruelty that had begun that very morning. An act that started with the squeak of gurney wheels and a nurse who wouldn't meet Lynn's eyes. Where are you taking me? Lynn had asked, her voice thin. The answer was a cold, administrative order. They moved her from the private wing Grant had once insisted on to a general postpartum floor. The lavender scent was gone, replaced by the harsh smell of bleach. A billing coordinator appeared soon after, her smile practiced. Your former husband terminated authorization this morning, she announced. The words landed like rubble. Lynn's premature babies, fighting for breath in the NICU, now required alternative arrangements for payment. She was wheeled past the NICU, begging the orderly to stop for just a moment. Pressing her hand against the glass, she saw 3 incubators, 3 tiny lives. I'm here, she whispered. That's when a hospital administrator appeared. Ms. Parker, we need to discuss discharge planning. The words were a slap. Lynn could barely walk. "Medically, you are stable," the woman stated, unmoved by Lynn's declaration that she had no home to go to. The cruelty was quiet, woven into paperwork and policy. By that evening, her meals were downgraded and her pain medication reduced. Across the city, Grant Holloway signed the final insurance cancellation, telling himself it wasn't personal. It was just a necessary business decision. People adjusted. Lynn saw his true intent when she scrolled through hours of her unanswered messages, all of them blocked. He wasn't just leaving her, he was trying to erase her. She curled into a ball, clutching a body that had given everything, and let the truth settle in. He was actively ensuring she couldn't survive without him. And yet, this entire nightmare, this calculated act of cruelty, was built upon a foundation of perceived love and security. It all began in a world that now seemed like a distant, impossible dream, a world where Lynn believed she was the cherished wife of a powerful man about to start a perfect family. She had spent months picking out names, decorating a nursery, and resting her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the 3 tiny heartbeats inside. In that life, Grant was attentive, bringing her lavender-scented oils to help her sleep and insisting on the best private suite the hospital had to offer for the delivery. He spoke of legacy, of building an empire for their children. He planned every detail, ensuring everything was perfect, all while holding a secret that would turn her world to dust. The man who kissed her forehead and promised to protect her and their babies was the same man who had already consulted with lawyers, preparing to sever all ties the moment his heirs were born. The love she thought was her shield was, in fact, the weapon he was honing. As she lay in that expensive private room just days before giving birth, she had no idea she wasn't a partner in his life, but merely a vessel for a clause in a will he knew nothing about. She smiled, feeling a kick, and whispered to her unborn children about the wonderful father they had, the perfect life that awaited them. So that's how it was. Withholding insurance and obstructing medical treatment were now on record, classified as efforts to inflict financial duress on a protected party. Lynn's hands were trembling. Grant had no idea about any of this. No, Ethan confirmed, and that might be his greatest miscalculation. Tears streamed down Lynn's face, but for once they weren't tears of despair. They came from a sharp, new feeling, validation. This was proof she wasn't crazy to feel like she'd been erased. "So what's next?" she managed to ask. Ethan snapped his briefcase shut. "Now we let things unfold, and we ensure you and your children are around to claim what was rightfully yours all along." He got up, but paused at the door. "One last thing. From this point on, every move Grant makes is being watched." After he was gone, Lynn leaned back on the pillow, eyes fixed on the ceiling as her thoughts raced. For the first time since waking up all alone, she didn't feel invisible. Because out there, beyond the hospital walls, a sleeping giant had finally acknowledged its true heir. And it was just a matter of time before the man who threw her away understood exactly who he had divorced. On paper, the 90-day review period seemed fair. In reality, it was a prison sentence. Marilyn Lynn Parker was sent home 2 days later, holding a prescription she couldn't afford and discharge papers that assumed she had a supportive home to recover in. She had neither. She walked out of the hospital wearing a coat someone had lent her, her go bag feeling much lighter than when she'd checked in months ago. There were no babies in her arms, only documents and a body full of pain. Standing at the curb, she paused before looking at her phone. Her bank account had $47. It was enough for a single ride. She ordered an Uber, since it was more affordable than a cab, not that she had a destination in mind. "Where to?" the driver asked. Lynn had to swallow hard. Anywhere that offers a discount for a long-term stay. In Tusco, the driver just nodded, showing no surprise, and merged with the traffic. The temporary room she secured was on the outskirts of Queens. It was compact and quiet, featuring a squeaky bed and a kitchenette that was barely functional. The air was thick with the faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Lynn didn't mind. It was a space where she could just lie down without being a financial burden to anyone. Each morning, she took the subway back to the hospital, her body aching from healing muscles and sutures. For hours, she would stand outside the NICU's glass wall, memorizing the number on every machine, the face of every nurse. She came to recognize the distinct sound of each of her baby's ventilators. One was steady, one was weak, and one sent a jolt of fear through her whenever its alarm beeped. She wasn't permitted to hold them. Soon, they all said. Grant Holloway never showed up. On the fifth day, a letter forwarded from the hospital arrived at her room. The envelope felt formal and heavy. It stated that her former husband had submitted an emergency petition for custody, claiming she was mentally unstable and financially incapable. Her hands trembled as she read it over and over. That evening, she contacted Ethan Cole. "He's trying to take my children," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm aware," Ethan responded, his tone steady. He filed it the second he learned the trust was in play. "So he knows," Lynn whispered. "He knows something," Ethan clarified, "but not the whole story. It's too late." The following week was a harder trial than any surgery. The pain returned, sharp and persistent without her medication. She slept in short, anxious bursts. On some days, she went without food to make sure she had enough money for the subway. She discovered just how unforgiving New York can be when you're invisible. Grant, in the meantime, was telling everyone that Lynn was sick and rejecting his offers of help. Belle Knox was often seen with him at dinners and charity functions, her hand placed possessively on his arm. Pictures of them appeared online, all smiles, champagne, and power. Lynn stumbled upon one by accident on her phone's cracked screen as she sat by herself on the train. She felt nothing. On the 12th day, one of the infants had a medical crisis. Lynn was rushed in from the hallway to see a blur of doctors moving with terrifying urgency. She squeezed her hands together until her knuckles were white, murmuring silent prayers she had no way of fulfilling. They managed to stabilize the baby, but just barely. That night, Lynn sat on her bed, staring into space, completely depleted. 90 days seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. Her phone vibrated. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Parker, my name is Julian Cross. Ethan Cole suggested I get in touch. I think I can assist you, but not in the way you might be expecting." Lynn's heart began to hammer against her ribs as she stared at the words, because for the first time since her world had collapsed, someone wasn't just offering pity. They were offering power. Marilyn Lynn Parker didn't respond immediately. She just sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the phone's light illuminating her face, rereading the name, Julian Cross. It was unfamiliar to her, but she knew Ethan Cole didn't make introductions without a good reason. He never wasted favors. He never connected people randomly. She typed a one-word reply. "How?" The answer arrived almost instantly. "Meet me tomorrow, Midtown. I'll text you the location." The next afternoon, Lynn found herself in front of a modest office building nestled between two towering glass structures near Bryant Park. There was no flashy sign, just clean architecture and an unobtrusive security desk. Pulling the borrowed coat tighter around her, she walked inside, her pulse quickening with each step. Julian Cross stood as she was shown into the conference room. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, composed and understated, wearing a simple dark suit that wasn't meant to intimidate. His gaze was assessing, not prying, as if he'd already reviewed her file and was now just taking in the details. "Miss Parker," he greeted, offering his hand. "I appreciate you coming." Lynn took it, then sat, clasping her hands on her lap. "You mentioned you could help." "I can," Julian confirmed. "But there's something you need to grasp first. My purpose isn't to rescue you." She gave a slow nod. "Good. I don't want to be saved." A hint of respect showed on his face. "I know. What I can provide is resources, time, and discretion." He pushed a folder toward her. It contained a set of neat professional documents, arrangements for temporary housing close to the hospital, and a moderate stipend listed as a consulting fee. There was no mention of charity or pity. "This will keep you stable through the review period," Julian explained. "It's completely separate from the trust. It won't tip off your ex-husband, and it won't affect your legal case." Lynn looked down at the documents. "Why are you doing this?" Julian settled back in his chair. "Because I maintain a long-term interest in Parker Hale Holdings, and because I have no patience for bullies who see restraint as a sign of weakness." She swallowed hard. "Grant has no idea who you are." "He doesn't need to," Julian replied. "Not for now." Lynn paused, then voiced the question that had been haunting her since she left the hospital. "What if I lose the custody review?" Julian's expression was unwavering. "You won't. But for the sake of argument, if you did, Grant would still end up losing." That got her attention. "How?" "Because," Julian stated plainly, "he's already shown his whole strategy. Custody battles, financial coercion, manipulating the public story. Judges notice that kind of pattern, particularly when it's all been documented." A knot of tension in Lynn's chest finally began to loosen. "So, what is it you want from me?" "Nothing, Joy," Julian said, "with one exception. You cannot react to him. Let him assume you're worn out. Let him be sure that you're trapped." A small, weary smile touched her lips. "I am worn out." "Yes," Julian agreed softly. "But you're no longer trapped. Over." The following 2 weeks, Lynn's circumstances changed dramatically, but quietly. She relocated to a small, furnished apartment just 10 minutes away from the hospital. She started eating proper meals again. The hospital finally permitted her to hold her babies, skin to skin, and she whispered promises to them as she held their tiny, fragile bodies. Grant continued to file legal motions. He hinted to others about his concerns for her. He was waiting for her to snap. She never did. One evening, as Lynn sat by the incubator, one of her baby's small hands curled around her finger for the very first time. In that moment, she felt it. Not quite hope, but a sense of certainty. The world had stopped shifting beneath her feet. And across town, Grant Holloway interpreted her quiet as a sign of defeat, completely unaware that the most critical part of the fight was just about to start. It was during the 3rd week that Grant Holloway began to notice the quiet. It wasn't anything overt. There were no furious text messages, no desperate emails, no public outcries. Marilyn Lynn Parker had simply fallen off his radar, and the sheer completeness of it was unnerving. Initially, he'd been relieved. Her silence suggested she was giving in. It meant she was exhausted, overwhelmed, and breaking down, just like he'd always known she would. But as the silence stretched on, it started to feel like something different entirely. Grant was in his office with its view of Wall Street, aimlessly scrolling on his phone as stock prices crawled by on a screen behind him. His assistant stood by, holding a tablet. "We still haven't heard anything from Miss Parker," she reported cautiously. Grant just scoffed. "Why would we? She's too busy trying not to drown." Still, he couldn't stop himself from checking. Hospital records, court updates, nothing had changed. It was just the same grinding process, the same 90-day waiting game that felt like a lifetime to a man accustomed to getting what he wanted instantly. Later, at an exclusive dinner party, Belle Knox cozied up to him, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his forearm. "You seem preoccupied lately," she purred. "Is it about her?" Grant's posture stiffened. "She is not a factor." Belle just smiled, clearly not buying it. "Then, how come her family name is popping up in conversations about new investments?" That stopped him. "What are you talking about?" "I just heard some people talking at the gala," Belle said offhandedly. "They brought up Parker Hale, but they said it in this hushed tone, like they were talking about a sleeping giant." Grant's jaw clenched. "It's not important." But later that night at home, he poured a drink he didn't want and just stared out at the city, a deep sense of unease creeping over him. The next morning, he called his legal team. "I need an update on Parker," he demanded. "I want to know everything." The report he got back was short. Way too short. There were no reports of meltdowns, no frantic legal motions, no filings for financial aid, nothing that fit the narrative of her total collapse that he had so carefully crafted. In reality, Lynn's days had fallen into a stable pattern Grant couldn't have fathomed. She dedicated her mornings to the NICU, her afternoons to resting, and her evenings to studying the court papers Ethan provided. Julian Cross made only essential calls with precise updates from a borrowed tablet, learning and observing without reacting. "Let him talk," he'd told her. "Every word he speaks without a response is just more evidence." And Grant talked, filing a more aggressive custody motion claiming she was emotionally unavailable with an unstable home. He leaked fabricated concerns to a friendly reporter, careful to imply, not name, he needed to apply pressure to force a reaction. He received nothing. No denial, no interview, no public meltdown. By the fourth week, one of his minor investors put a meeting on hold, then another followed. A third asked for a report on his exposure from personal legal issues. Grant yelled at his assistant, blaming bad timing and a volatile market. But late one night in his office, he saw a private memo he was never meant to read. It spoke of a potential shift in capital connected to the activations of a legacy trust. His hands froze on the keyboard. Parker Hale. Miles away, Lynn cradled her smallest baby, feeling the delicate breaths of a life she'd almost lost. For once, waiting didn't fill her with fear, because she knew something Grant couldn't grasp. Silence wasn't weakness, it was absolute control. As Grant Holloway finally felt the foundation beneath him start to crumble, he made a critical error. He pushed even harder, blind to the fact that every move was only tightening the trap he was building for himself. Grant Holloway knew it was time for a public appearance. The silence had gone on too long, and in his world, being seen was a show of strength. If his money people were getting nervous, the answer was simple. Act like you've already won. Control the story. The Plaza Hotel's charity gala was the perfect stage. Among Manhattan's financial royalty, Grant arrived right on schedule, Belle clinging to his arm as cameras flashed. He wore his confidence like armor. "Smile," Belle whispered. "They're all watching." Grant smiled, shook hands, and spoke of growth and stability, of a future clear of any distractions. When asked about his private life, he gave a well-practiced line. "Sometimes," he said with a light tone, "you have to make tough calls to protect what you're building." It worked perfectly. Heads nodded in approval. All across the grand ballroom, investors weren't just seeing Grant. They were seeing composure and strength. He felt the familiar thrill of victory. This was his arena. This was his win. But then his gaze fell on an unexpected figure by the bar. Ethan Cole. The man worked for outcomes, not firms. Their eyes met, and Ethan offered a polite, unreadable nod. Grant dismissed it. Then his phone buzzed, and again. It was a message from his CFO. "We have a problem." Grant stepped into a corridor and typed back, "What is it?" A moment later, the reply came, "One of our main investors is pulling back, citing risk related to a legacy trust review." Grant's blood ran cold. "Which one?" The answer felt like a punch. "Parker Hale." "That's inactive," Grant typed frantically. "We thought so too," the CFO replied. "But someone with serious pull is making them think twice." Grant shoved the phone in his pocket and walked back into the party, a perfect smile plastered on his face. But the world had tilted. The music felt sharp, and the room suffocatingly small. Across the city, Marilyn Lynn Parker sat beside three glass bassinets in the NICU. She knew nothing of the gala because she didn't have to. While Grant was projecting strength, the very ground he stood on was fracturing, and no amount of confidence could fix it. The explosive headlines Grant Holloway expected never materialized. In the days after the gala, his name was still in the business pages, but a subtle change had taken place. Invitations became less frequent, calls were returned, a little slower, and Marilyn Lynn Parker was nowhere to be seen. In his office, Grant's assistant stood nervously before him. "I can't find her," she said. "No new hospital records, no court filings. She hasn't responded to a single thing." Grant's jaw clenched. "She's hiding." Or, the assistant ventured, "she doesn't have to." Whispers began not in the gossip columns, but in boardrooms. The Parker Hale Trust. Who was behind it now? Why her? Why this moment? Ethan Cole's name started appearing on private meeting schedules. Julian Cross canceled public engagements. A partner at a private equity firm quietly divested from Grant's latest project. It wasn't a catastrophe, just a series of small, unsettling tremors. Grant tried to seize control the only way he knew how, by attacking. His lawyers filed for a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation of Lynn, using careful, cruel language about postpartum trauma. He expected outrage. He was met with silence. That night, alone in his penthouse, he stared down at the city lights, thinking one thing: she should be breaking by now. But Lynn's days were quiet and focused. Her babies were getting stronger. She was learning to hold them without fear, to live beside the beeping machines. Julian Cross paid a single, brief visit. "You're doing well," was all he said. She didn't have to ask about Grant. Ethan provided short updates. "He's getting reckless," he told her. "Good," Lynn replied. "Why?" he asked. "Because reckless people make mistakes." A nurse later mentioned a reporter had called asking if Lynn was a patient there. "We told them we don't comment on patient status," the nurse said. Lynn's heart remained steady. Grant needed a public spectacle of her collapse. Instead, she had simply vanished. And in a city that runs on being seen, her absence became a question everyone was asking. Who is protecting her? And what is she planning? Grant Holloway now understood that he was no longer writing this story. He was just a character in it. And somewhere in the complex world of finance he once commanded, Marilyn Lynn Parker was no longer a problem to be managed. She was a power to be reckoned with. Finally, Grant reached out himself. A message sent through a private channel he thought he still controlled. "We need to talk. For the kids. For closure." Lynn read the words in the small kitchen of her temporary apartment. One baby asleep on her chest, while the other two rested peacefully in the NICU. She forwarded it to Ethan Cole. His reply was instant. "Good. He's ready." The meeting was 3 days later, in a conference room Grant chose, a place where he felt in control. He stood by the window as she walked in, his expression a careful mix of concern and regret. "Lynn," he said softly, "you look exhausted." She ignored the remark and sat, her posture calm, just as Julian had coached her. Grant took a breath as if her quiet demeanor confirmed his plan. "This doesn't have to be a war," he started. "We can stop this before it hurts the children." "The children are in the hospital," Lynn stated, her voice even. This was the moment everything had been building toward. His attempt to look reasonable was the final piece of a puzzle she, Julian, and Ethan had been assembling for weeks. His patronizing tone, his offer of a truce, it wasn't an act of kindness. It was the desperate move of a man who had finally realized he was cornered, a man who had mistaken silence for surrender. And that mistake was about to cost him everything. Grant Holloway had been so sure of his power. He filed the initial custody motion while Lynn was still in the hospital, recovering from a traumatic birth that had left their 3 premature babies fighting for their lives in the NICU. He saw a broken woman, an easy victory. He sent lawyers with papers she was too weak to read, leveraging her fear and exhaustion against her. He couldn't have imagined that in her darkest, most vulnerable moment, Lynn Parker would find a different kind of strength. Instead of crying or fighting back in the press, she had made 2 calls. The first was to Julian Cross, the most feared litigator in the city. The second was to Ethan Cole, a man who quietly managed the fortunes of families like hers. She hadn't asked them to fight a war. She had asked them to build a fortress of silence around her, knowing Grant's own ego would eventually lead him to tear down his entire empire trying to breach it. And that is exactly how it was. Marilyn Lynn Parker walked into the boardroom on the 42nd floor, and the room fell silent. She moved with an unhurried calm, her posture perfect, her expression clear. She looked not like a victim, but like a woman who was precisely where she was supposed to be. Grant Holloway, who had been staring out at the city from his glass throne, felt his breath catch. He had expected lawyers, not her. "What is she doing here?" he snapped. Julian Cross, who followed her in, replied coolly, "She's here on my invitation, and with the board's consent." This was how justice began, not with a shout, but with a quiet entrance that changed the balance of power in an instant. The trap, so carefully set, had finally sprung. But how had it come to this? Just hours before, Grant's carefully constructed world had been imploding. The first sign of trouble was a call from his chief financial officer at 6:42 in the morning, reporting that 3 major partners had frozen their capital overnight, citing clause alignment issues. Annoyance had curdled into alarm when his legal team explained the cause. "Your signature acknowledges awareness of the Parker Hale Trust's activation," one lawyer had stated grimly. Grant's disbelieving laugh had died in his throat. The trust, he thought, was long dead. It wasn't. It had been activated upon the birth of their triplets, a detail he'd overlooked, a vulnerability he never knew he had. His signature. That was the key. He had been so certain of his victory just days earlier in that private conference room. He remembered Lynn's subdued demeanor, her tired eyes, and her soft voice. "I don't want to fight," she had said. "I'm so tired." He had offered his heavy, expensive Mont Blanc pen, feeling a surge of triumph as she signed the settlement papers. He had seen it as a surrender, a final closing of a messy chapter. He was so focused on his win that he never noticed the addendum slipped into the stack, a document that didn't offer peace, but instead served as his signed confession, acknowledging the very trust he was trying to erase. That moment of feigned defeat had been meticulously planned. Across the city, in a much smaller office, Lynn had rehearsed it with her advisors, Ethan Cole and Julian Cross. "He needs to feel in control," Julian had instructed. "He needs to believe he's won." Ethan, the legal architect, had drafted the addendum himself. It was a masterpiece of legal subtlety, a provision that would only trigger if activated by a protected trust review. A review that Lynn's signature, alongside Grant's, would initiate. They weren't fighting his lawsuit. They were building a cage around him, using his own arrogance as the blueprint. The plan was set in motion the day Grant's lawyers served her with the initial divorce papers. The offer was insulting, designed to leave her and the children with just enough to be quiet, but not enough to be secure. He had grossly underestimated her. Sitting in her living room, the legal documents on the table, Lynn looked at the pictures of her children. There were no tears, only a hardening resolve. She picked up the phone and made her first call to Julian Cross. An old family friend Grant had dismissed as unimportant. The war hadn't started in the boardroom when she walked in. It didn't start when Grant's partners froze his funds, or even when he pushed that pin across the table. No, the war began in that quiet moment with a single, insulting legal document. Grant had intended to swiftly cut her out of his life, erasing her from his empire. But instead of breaking her, he had given her a reason to fight. He had provided the one thing she needed to dismantle his world, a cause. And so, it was all set in motion, not by lawyers in high-rise towers, but by a mother's promise in a quiet home. Serious things had become. When he turned, the seats were filling quickly. Advisors, legal counsel, 2 investors who had never attended internal meetings before. No one met his eyes for long. The air felt heavier than usual, dense with questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Then the door opened again. Grant expected another lawyer. Instead, Marilyn Lynn Parker walked in. The room stilled. She wasn't wearing a power suit or anything dramatic, just a tailored navy dress, simple, understated. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her posture was straight, calm, unhurried. She didn't look fragile. She didn't look defeated. She looked prepared. Grant's breath caught before he could stop it. "What is she doing here?" he snapped. Julian Cross stepped in behind her, closing the door. "She's here at my invitation," he said evenly. And with the board's consent, murmurs rippled around the table. Lynn met Grant's eyes for the first time in weeks. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, only clarity. That unsettled him more than rage ever could. She took a seat near the end of the table, folding her hands the same way she had during their last meeting. Familiar, disarming. "Let's begin," the board chair said carefully. "Mr. Holloway, we've been made aware of developments regarding your personal litigation exposure and its potential impact on company valuation." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Lynn spoke first. "I won't take much of your time," she said, voice steady, carrying easily through the room. "I'm not here to discuss our marriage. I'm here to clarify risk." Several heads turned toward her. "The Parker Hale Trust has completed its preliminary activation review," Lynn continued. "While assets remain restricted, beneficiary protections are fully enforceable. Lynn met his gaze one last time. "No, Grant. I survived it." She stood, gave a polite nod to the board, and simply said, "That's all." As she and Julian walked out, the door clicked shut behind them, a soft, final sound. Grant was left standing alone at the head of a table, surrounded by people who no longer saw him as a leader. In a single, quiet moment, Marilyn Lynn Parker had achieved the impossible. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't make accusations. She just re-entered his world long enough to pull back the curtain and show everyone the truth. The fallout was silent, a quiet shift of power, not a loud explosion. By noon, Grant Holloway's schedule was a ghost town. Confirmed meetings vanished. Investor calls went to voicemail, intentionally ignored. In the hallways outside his glass office, conversations would die the moment he approached. The people who once scrambled for his approval now couldn't even meet his eye. At 1:17 p.m., the board chair summoned him. This time, Grant didn't command the room from the window. He sat, his hands clenched on the table, a mask of control locked on his face. The same people sat across from him, but their entire demeanor had changed. They were detached, evaluative. "We've reviewed the risk assessment," the chair began, "and the external pressure." Grant gave a single, sharp nod. "Temporary turbulence." An investor cleared his throat. "It's more than turbulence. 3 funds have formally withdrawn." Grant's head snapped up. "Withdrawn? Not divested," the investor clarified, then paused. "Pending the outcome." A cold knot formed in Grant's stomach. Outcome of what? Another board member spoke the words like stones. "Your leadership." The company's lawyer slid a document across the polished table. "Your actions, while not criminal, have created significant reputational and regulatory vulnerabilities for the company." The lawyer continued, "especially given the disclosures related to the trust." Grant shoved the paper away. "This company is me." The chair's gaze was unwavering. "That used to be an asset." A heavy, decisive silence filled the room. "We're invoking the contingency clause," the chair said. "Effective immediately, the board is appointing an interim CEO while we reassess governance." Grant let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You're benching me over a personal matter." "We're protecting the company," the chair countered, "from instability." The irony was a bitter pill. Across town, Marilyn Lynn Parker was in the NICU, holding one tiny baby against her chest while her other 2 slept in their incubators. Dr. Reed offered a gentle smile. "They're doing remarkably well." Lynn nodded, her vision blurred by tears of pure relief. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She ignored it. Back in the boardroom, Grant slowly got to his feet. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low. "She can't even access the trust yet." Julian Cross's words, spoken through the board's counsel, hung in the air. "Access isn't the point. Influence is." Grant's mouth fell open, but for the first time, he had no argument left. By evening, a carefully phrased internal memo announced a temporary leadership transition and strategic realignment. The market's reaction wasn't panic, but a chilling caution. The stock dipped. Analysts grew wary. Confidence was eroding. Grant went home to his penthouse alone. All of Bell's belongings were gone. A note on the counter simply read, "I need space." He barely registered it, staring out at the city skyline with a glass of whiskey he never touched. He was just beginning to understand that his entire empire was built on belief, and belief was terrifyingly fragile. But he still didn't grasp the worst part. This wasn't the end of his reckoning. It was just the start. The first sign for Belle Knox was the silence. Her invitations dried up. At first, she dismissed it as a slow week in Manhattan. But after the 3rd unanswered text and a 2nd canceled lunch, the truth was unavoidable. Her calendar, once a flurry of exclusive parties and high-profile dinners, was suddenly blank. She sat alone in a Soho cafe, watching social media stories from rooms she was no longer in, featuring women she used to call friends. Her name had lost its heat, a fatal condition in her circle. Just 2 weeks ago, being with Grant Holloway opened every door. Now it made them stick. Whispers trailed her, not loud enough to fight, but sharp enough to cut. She backed the wrong horse. She thought she was untouchable. That night, she let herself into Grant's penthouse. He stood by the window, staring at the city that had turned on him. "You should have told me," Belle said. "Told you what?" "That it was all falling apart," she snapped. "I'm being frozen out everywhere." He finally looked at her, his eyes cold and exhausted. "This isn't about you." It became about me when your disaster started ruining my reputation, she fired back. He laughed softly. Your reputation? Belle flushed with anger. I stood by you. No, Grant said, his voice like ice. You stood next to power. Now, you see, it was never yours. The words hit harder than a slap. The next morning, her agency dropped her. The meeting was 12 minutes long. By the afternoon, another client backed out. Meanwhile, Marilyn Lynn Parker's name was being spoken with a new kind of gravity, a quiet respect. In a desperate move, Bell offered a reporter a story on Grant's divorce, trying to shift the blame. The story never ran. A warning came back. No one is touching that. Not her, not now. That night, Belle packed her bags and left the key on the counter next to Grant's untouched glass of whiskey. She finally understood. You don't win by siding with a man who sets fire to his own life. You just burn with him. Grant Holloway stood outside the hospital for nearly 10 minutes before forcing himself to go inside. The building was the same, but his world had changed. The revolving door no longer felt like his to command. He straightened his coat out of habit and walked to the front desk. I'm here to see Marilyn Parker, he said, his voice low. The receptionist glanced at her screen. She's no longer listed under that name. Grant swallowed hard. Lynn, then? A pause. Room 612. Visiting hours end in 20 minutes. He walked away before she could see the relief on his face. Each step down the quiet hall echoed. He stopped at the door, his hand hovering, with no idea what he was about to say. Apologies had never come easy to him. The morning quiet in the apartment felt different now, a calm that signaled peace, not abandonment. Sunlight warmed 3 cribs where her children slept, breathing steady. This was the life she'd secured. 90 days had passed since the Parker Hale Trust review concluded, giving her complete authority. Money was no longer a concept, it was protection. She settled every last medical bill for the nurses and doctors who saved her children, then anonymously started a hospital fund for other premature infants before simply going home. It was here that Julian Cross became a steady presence, not as a savior, but as a partner. I'm asking to walk beside you, he'd said one evening, and she knew he meant it. This hard-won peace was why she was so composed when Grant finally knocked on her door. He found her by the window, a baby in her arms, her calm unshakable. I have lost control of the company, he confessed, the words sounding hollow. Investors pulled back. He claimed he never intended for it to go so far. But Lynn saw through it. You understood? She stated evenly. You just didn't care. He tried using the children to bargain, but she refused. You don't get to use them now. He told her she was stronger than he thought, but as he turned to leave, she offered one last correction. I didn't become strong. I remembered that I already was. She had remembered it in a silent courtroom, telling a judge, I'm not here to argue who has more money. I'm here to show who showed up. As hospital records proved her vigil. That was the moment everything turned, when the judge overruled the objections and focused on a single, devastating fact. Grant had canceled medical coverage just hours after her surgery. And suddenly, everyone understood how it all began. With sunlight streaming through the trees in a quiet garden by the Hudson, Marilyn Lynn Parker walked down a grassy aisle. She moved with purpose, savoring each step toward the life she had chosen. Julian Cross was waiting, his calm presence a steady anchor. 3 bassinets sat in the front row, a perfect picture of their new reality. When he took her hands, there were no grand pronouncements, just a simple question. Will you build a life with me? Looking from her sleeping children to the man before her, Lynn gave the only answer that mattered. Yes. Because this moment wasn't about revenge, it was about choice. It was the reward of safety, love, and a future that was finally her own. As she closed the chapter that almost broke her, Lynn stepped into the one she had earned, strong, complete, and utterly free. Their vows were a quiet promise, whispered in the late afternoon air. "We choose each other," Julian said, his voice clear, "every day, especially on the hard ones." Lynn's eyes shone as she nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." They were married as the sun began to set over the river. While guests mingled with gentle laughter, Lynn stole a moment at the garden's edge. She watched her babies breathe peacefully, a sight she once thought impossible. Julian joined her, his hand finding hers in the comfortable silence. They were a world away from the noise and chaos of their pasts. In another part of the city, Grant Holloway looked at the same fading sun from an office that no longer felt like his. The buzz of assistance was gone. The power had vanished. His phone lit up, a news alert for an award he used to win, now given to a rival. He ignored it. His new ventures all fizzled out, not from a lack of skill, but because the trust he had shattered could never be glued back together. He sometimes thought of Lynn, not with rage, but with the heavy weight of regret. He had believed his power made him immune to consequences, a mistake that had cost him everything. Back in the garden, Lynn raised a glass. To second chances, she toasted softly, and to the people who show up when it counts. Grant's name was never mentioned. He wasn't a villain to be defeated. He was a lesson learned, a past managed by time and his own choices. As the evening drew in, Lynn and Julian gathered their children, moving as a single, beautifully, imperfectly new unit toward their new home. Later, the wedding ring a warm weight on her finger, she smiled. She hadn't won a war. She had simply survived, rebuilt, and chosen to be happy on her own terms. And if you found a piece of your own strength in this story, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your being here shows that stories of quiet resilience matter more than you know. Let's take a moment to sit with what we just witnessed. Because this isn't just a story about a wealthy woman who got revenge on a cruel ex-husband. That would be satisfying, sure, but it wouldn't stay with you. This story stays with you because it's about something deeper, something that touches every single one of us. Whether we've been divorced, abandoned, betrayed, or simply made to feel invisible by someone who is supposed to protect us. Let's start with the hardest truth this story reveals. Grant Holloway did not fail because he was a bad businessman. He failed because he confused control with strength. He believed that eliminating anything that made him feel vulnerable, his wife, his children, his obligations, would make him more powerful. And for a while, the world agreed with him. People nodded at his decisions. Investors admired his ruthlessness. Society rewarded his coldness and called it leadership. But here's what Grant never understood. True strength is not about removing what makes you vulnerable. True strength is about standing in the middle of your vulnerability and choosing not to run. Lynn Parker had every reason to collapse. She woke up from surgery alone. She had no money, no home, no insurance, and 3 babies who might not survive the night. The man she loved had not just left her, he had systematically tried to make sure she could never recover. And yet, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't go to the press. She got on the subway every single morning with stitches still healing in her body, and she showed up. That is the first lesson. Showing up, quietly, consistently, even when no one is watching, is the most powerful thing a human being can do. Lynn didn't win because she had a secret trust fund. She was already winning before she knew that money existed. She won the moment she pressed her hand against that glass wall in the NICU and whispered, "I'm here." Because presence is a kind of power that money cannot buy. and cruelty cannot destroy. The second lesson is about silence. We live in a world that tells us we must respond to every attack, defend every accusation, match every blow with a louder one. Grant expected exactly that. He expected Lynn to fight publicly, to cry on camera, to make desperate legal moves he could use against her. When she didn't, it terrified him. Her silence became a mirror, and when he looked into it, all he could see was his own ugliness reflected back at him. If someone in your life is trying to provoke you into a reaction right now, a toxic ex, a manipulative coworker, a family member who thrives on drama, consider the possibility that your greatest weapon is not a sharper response. It might be no response at all. Let them fill the silence with their own anxiety. Let them wonder. Let them exhaust themselves, swinging at air. You are not obligated to participate in every conflict you are invited to. The third lesson is perhaps the most important one. Lynn Parker did not do this alone. She had Dr. Naomi Reed, a woman she had never met, who looked at a chart and saw not a billing problem, but a human being in danger. She had Ethan Cole, who showed up in a hospital room at midnight because he understood that justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it knocks quietly. She had Julian Cross, who offered resources without asking for gratitude, who said, "I'm not here to rescue you," and meant it as a compliment. No one survives alone, and asking for help is not weakness, it is wisdom. The strongest people in this story were not the ones with the most money or the loudest voices. They were the ones who recognized injustice and chose to act, even when it wasn't their fight. If you are going through something difficult right now, look around you. There is a Dr. Reed in your life somewhere. Someone who will say, "Not on my watch," but you have to let them in. You have to accept the hand that is offered, even when pride tells you to refuse. And finally, this story teaches us something about endings. Lynn Parker did not destroy Grant Holloway. She didn't have to. He destroyed himself, one arrogant decision at a time. Every motion he filed, every lie he told, every insurance form he canceled, he thought he was building walls around her. He was actually building a cage around himself. The most satisfying justice is not the kind you have to deliver. It's the kind that arrives on its own, carried by the weight of someone else's choices catching up with them. So if you are waiting for karma, if you are waiting for the person who hurt you to finally face consequences, your job is not to chase that moment. Your job is to keep going, to heal, to show up, to build something so steady and so real that when their world finally crumbles, and it will, you are too busy living your life to even notice. Lynn Parker raised a glass at her wedding and toasted to second chances and to the people who show up when it counts. She never mentioned Grant's name. He wasn't a villain to be defeated. He was a chapter to be closed. And that perhaps is the greatest victory of all. Not winning, but moving forward so completely that the person who tried to end your story becomes nothing more than a footnote in the extraordinary life you built without them. Remember this, your worth is never, ever determined by the people who leave you. It is defined by the quiet, steady way you rise. And you will rise. If this story reminded you of your own strength, or if it reminded you of someone who needs to hear this right now, please hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see your own life. Leave a comment below and tell me what moment in this story hit you the hardest. I read every single one, and your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and real emotional value to our audience. All characters, names, and events in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or medical advice.